Our theme for 2021 is redeeming the time. And I started a series in Daniel, and then I went away for a week, and I'm going to pick it up this week. And next week we're going to have Barry Perez with us, and so I'll pick it up again in 2 weeks, and then I'll be gone for another week, and we'll pick it up again. So we're going to be back and forth a little bit here. By the way, Pat, did you happen to read through Daniel chapter 4 when you were preparing your songs for today? I would have thought so, because you just took us on a musical journey through the text I'm about to cover. Beautiful. So happy Mother's Day. We honor the women in our lives, the women who have nurtured us. Thank you for that testimony, Sandy. Yes, it's not just bearing children, but it's carrying people in our hearts through those moments where they might otherwise wander away. I realize that Mother's Day is not happy for everyone. I know people who stay home from church on Mother's Day intentionally. There are those who have lost a mother. There are mothers who have lost children. There are those who never knew their mother. And then there are those who wish they could become a mother. And then there are those who have a mother, but wish that somehow that person was different from what they are. But we honor all of you today. Those who have earned a job well done, and those who grieve an aspect of their life that is yet incomplete. You know, isn't it good to be able to admit that we're not perfect? You don't have to be a perfect mother for us to honor you today. We can honor one another without the pressure to perform. No parent is perfect, but all are deserving of honor. Only God is perfect, and we are being formed into His image. Today we're going to pick up our lesson on Daniel. We're going to focus not so much on Daniel or his three friends, but on King Nebuchadnezzar. Remember him? We already saw some of his insecurity trying to extort information from his advisors and then making them bow to a statue as a test of their loyalty. You know, a king has a pretty big job. If he does it well, people thrive. If he doesn't, people suffer. Archaeologists tell us that the kingdom of Babylon prospered under Nebuchadnezzar II. Babylon, as they've excavated it, had multiple layers of fortification. The outer wall of the ancient city of Babylon was 17 miles long, and it was so wide that 2 chariots could pass one another on top of the wall. Somewhere in proximity to the royal palace was the Hanging Garden, which was described by the Greeks as being one of the 7 wonders of the world. Here you have an artist's depiction of what that might have looked like. The Hanging Garden was described as an artificial terraced mountain made of brick with irrigation pumps to disperse the water throughout the entire structure, with plants, flowers, and trees covering the terraces. Imagine being able to look out from up there. Look out all over the countryside, to be able to see far beyond the wall while being surrounded by lush tropical vegetation above you, below you, all around you. Imagine being surrounded by beauty all day, every day. You might say that Nebuchadnezzar had built a man-made Eden. No kidding. A man-made Eden. The garden of God on the mountain of God. All that was missing was the presence of God. But can you ever escape the presence of God? We've talked a lot about suffering and difficult times. But sometimes the most dangerous time is when everything is going well. I say dangerous because it's at those times that we may forget about God. Or worse, we may be tempted to think that we don't need God. Without God, life loses meaning. Relationships lose purpose, and we lose our sanity. And that's the story that we're going to see today. Time and providence will show that God is the source of every good thing. Today's Mother's Day. We're remembering our mothers. We're remembering the ones who gave us birth. But wouldn't it be good to remember our source? To remember our Creator? To remember the one who, through her, gave us life? Let's talk first about what it means to get too comfortable. We begin again with the declaration that concluded our last story. Remember that? At the end of chapter 3, I actually wandered into chapter 4 for about 3 verses. When the Bible was written, there were no chapters and verses. So the first 3 verses of chapter 4, the question is, do they belong in chapter 4 or do they belong with chapter 3? Well, there's a couple of different ways of looking at it. Remember, chapter 3 concludes with God delivering Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego from the fiery furnace, and the king's conclusion was that the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is the God to be worshipped. So these 3 verses fit really well with chapter 3. However, they may also fit very well with chapter 4 because there's this technique, especially in Hebrew poetry, called a chiasm, from the Greek letter chi, which is like an X. The idea is that you take and you tell a story in such a way that the beginning and the ending are like bookends, and what's in the middle is kind of the meat of the sandwich. And it's a way of describing something in a way that helps you to see the whole. So if it's part of chapter 4, then verses 1 through 3 actually represent the conclusion of the story, which is retold again at the beginning so that you'll get the whole picture. Let's take a look at Daniel 4, verses 1 to 3. King Nebuchadnezzar, to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. It seemed good to me to show the signs and wonders that the Most High has done for me. How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion endures from generation to generation. Wow. That's quite a statement made by arguably the greatest king in all of the earth at that time. Commentators suggest that as much as 30 years have passed between chapter 3 and chapter 4. So if King Nebuchadnezzar was convinced that the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is the Most High God after seeing them delivered from the fiery furnace, what happened? What happened in those 30 years? Well, some people say the King Nebuchadnezzar was never truly converted, as is evidenced by today's story. But there's another possibility. There's a possibility that he did, in fact, have an amazing encounter with God, but he's what we call backslidden, no longer responding to the truth of that encounter. Here's your first fill in the blank. If you're following along either on your e-bulletin or in your paper bulletin, backsliding begins with forgetting God's presence. Backsliding begins with forgetting God's presence. Maybe you've experienced this. I think Sandy kind of described a story like this. Have you ever run into someone who you know had an encounter with God, but years later it seems like nothing happened? Yeah, sure. God appeared in the fire, right? But for weeks after that, we were busy with reporters and talk shows, right? And then what happened? Well, then after that, nothing. Everybody just kind of moved on. So we moved on. Sometimes I even burn myself when cooking and wonder, God, why did you deliver me from the fire, but you can't deliver me from this? You ever had those experiences? Actually, I think that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were okay after that. Although, it's interesting, they don't appear anymore in the book of Daniel. The king, on the other hand, has another crisis. Let's pick up in verse 4. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at ease in my house and prospering in my palace. And I saw a dream that made me afraid. As I lay in bed, the fancies and visions of my head alarmed me. What happened? Life happened. God was so real in that moment 30 years ago, but there's been lots of other moments since that moment. Moments where you wonder, where is God? You know, sometimes we associate God's presence with a particular feeling, right? And when the feeling's not there, we think that God's not there. Unless we are intentional about remembering that encounter with God, it is so easy to forget. Did you know, or have you heard this, that most of the greatest failures occur later in life and later in ministry? Have you heard that? I've heard that, and it sobers me as a pastor. Think about the people who failed in the Bible. Gideon, Jephthah, Samson, David, Solomon, Hezekiah. All of them had a period of success followed by a catastrophic failure. For some of them, like Solomon, the failure didn't really happen until the next generation. His children did not continue in the way that he started. Somewhere along the way, all of these people got too comfortable. They began to take for granted that God was with them. They were no longer pursuing God, or in some cases even inquiring of God. They started to do things, read these stories of the kings, they started to do things without asking God. When we get so used to doing things for God that we forget to be with God, that's when we're setting ourselves up for failure. The inner life and the outer life no longer match. Take a look at these verses up here. Verse 4 and verse 5. Verse 4 is the outer life. Verse 5 is the inner life. On the outside, everything's going well. I'm at ease. I'm content. Everything's prosperous. On the inside, I'm terrified. I'm frightened. My dreams, my thoughts disturb me. We work so hard at keeping it together because that's what everybody expects. But sometimes inside, we're a mess. God is out there somewhere. Somewhere in our past, we've had an encounter with God. But inside, his presence is conspicuously absent. King Nebuchadnezzar, too, appeared to be thriving. The first part of his vision was this vision of a tree that was prospering and thriving, and everybody was benefiting from its fruit. But the tree had to be cut down. Why? because inside the tree was rotten. The tree was not healthy. The flow of life was restricted. Let's read about this. Pick up in verse 13. I saw in the visions of my head as I lay in bed, and behold, a watcher, a holy one, came down from heaven. He proclaimed aloud and said thus, chop down the tree and lop off its branches, strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit, lest the beasts flee from under it and the birds from its branches. But leave the stump of its roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze, amid the tender grass of the field. Let him be wet with the dew of heaven. Let his portion be with the beasts in the grass of the earth. Let his mind be changed from a man's, and let a beast's mind be given to him, and let 7 periods of time pass over him. Here's the next fill in the blank. Mankind without God is reduced to an animal. That's right, an animal. Have you ever thought about what it means to be human? People used to say that animals are different because they don't have a soul. Well, what I learned a soul is its mind, will, and emotions. Ask any animal lover and they'll tell you that animals are pretty smart. They have a mind. They definitely have a will. And they're capable of emotion. So maybe having a soul is really a spiritual quality. We've learned we're made in the image of God. That is a status that we have because we are created for capacity for relationship with God. Maybe, just as animals have a capacity for relationship with humans, we have a capacity for relationship with God. The more animals interact with us, the more human they seem, right? The more we relate to God, the more godly we become. That capacity grows as it's cultivated. Notice this angelic messenger is called a watcher. Now, this is the only place, there's 3 times in Daniel this term is used. A watcher. Literally, it means one who is awakened. An awakened being appears to him. So, the king's lethargic state, he is losing his awareness of God, and this awakened being appears to him. The messenger is contrasted with the recipient. You know, spiritual beings see things and they know things that we don't yet have the capacity to see or to know. Let me take you to Psalm 8. We talked about this a little while ago in Sunday school. Beginning in verse 3, when I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place, what is man that you are mindful of him? And the Son of Man that you even care for him. Yet you have made him a little lower than the heavenly beings and crowned him with glory and honor. You have given him dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under his feet, all the sheep and oxen and also the beasts of the field. So here we have it. Mankind is somewhere between the heavenly beings and the animals in terms of capacity for spiritual awareness. We learned in the unseen realm that God has a plan to redeem humanity and to use us as an example to all the unseen realm, to all the spiritual beings of his power and his grace. But King Nebuchadnezzar is moving in the wrong direction. He's moving more to becoming like one of the animals than to becoming like one of the spiritual beings. He's going down the ladder, not up. You know, there's a Hebrew word for fool, which means lacking sense, and it literally means like cattle. In Hebrew, it's ba'ah. It sounds like a cow mooing, ba'ah, you know. I've worked with cows for many years. Put that cartoon up there. Just a little bit of humor here. Cows are creatures of habit. They can't think. Or mostly they just don't think. That's why the Far Side is so funny. Cow poetry, right? They prefer to eat the same things. They prefer to lie in the same spot and keep the same schedule. If you change their routine, they will let you know. They would have the strength to bust out of their stanchion. But for the most part, they never try. Unless something scares them, which I did as a kid. I remember one time riding my bike in the barn. I scared a few cows, and they found out that they were stronger than they thought they were. It's only when something frightens them that they get creative. Now think about it. Are we more like heavenly beings, or are we becoming more like cattle? When we get too comfortable, we get lazy, and we often forget the purpose for which we are created. What is the purpose for which we are created? Well, there's a famous creed that answers that. The Westminster Shorter Catechism of 1647 asks, what is the chief end of man? Go to the next slide. What is the chief end of man? And you know what the answer is? The chief end of man is to glorify God and to enjoy Him forever. To glorify God and to enjoy Him forever. That's what you were created for. You were created to glorify God and to enjoy Him forever. Now that's moving up the ladder. Here's the next fill in the blank. God rules. God rules. That is the point after all. Let's look at verse 17. The sentence is by decree of the watchers. The decision by the word of the holy ones, to the end that the living may know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom He will and sets over it the lowliest of men. Here we have heavenly beings, the divine council, deciding and decreeing that King Nebuchadnezzar is critically off course and requires divine intervention. God wants us to know Him. He wants us to enjoy Him. He wants us to rule with Him. But if we insist on going it alone, God will allow for a time us to go our own way, because He wants us to exercise our own will. But ultimately, when that will leads us away from God, there has to be some correction. Proverbs 14:12 says this, there is a way that seems right to the man, but in the end, it's the way to death. You know, one of the major themes of Daniel is God's sovereignty. Certainly, God is able to control things on earth, but so often He doesn't. So often, God holds back in order to draw us out. I don't believe God causes suffering, but God certainly allows it. Especially if that's what it takes to get our attention or to shape our character, to help us become more like Him. Let's talk about the next portion, losing your mind. Losing your mind. Verse 19, then Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, was dismayed for a while, and his thoughts alarmed him. Sound familiar? And the king answered and said, Belteshazzar, let not the dream or the interpretation alarm you. Belteshazzar answered him and said, my lord, may the dream be for those who hate you, and its interpretation for your enemies. So here's Daniel, a Jewish prince, serving in the palace of a foreign king. He's been trained in the ways of Babylon. Remember, they were basically brainwashing these guys. But he has a genuine interest in the prosperity of the city in which he now lives. Now that was something that was instructed through the prophet Jeremiah. Jeremiah 29:7 Jeremiah says, "But seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare." So Daniel has a genuine concern for the king and for the city where he is. But Daniel has not forgotten the God of Israel. He knows that he is in covenant with the one true God. And while he is serving in Babylon, he sees God's hand at work in everything. He sees God's sovereignty, even over the king of Babylon. And in his own thoughts and in his own work, he understands God to be at work. That's the next fill in the blank. Your ability is because of God's sovereignty. You ever thought about that? Your ability is because of God's sovereignty. Who gave you that ability to do things that make you so confident in yourself? Who gave you that ability? Let's pick up in verse 24. "This is the interpretation, O king. It is a decree of the Most High, which has come upon my lord the king. You shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. You shall be made to eat grass like an ox, and you shall be wet with the dew of heaven. 7 periods of time shall pass over you, till you know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will. And it was commanded to leave the stumps of the roots of the tree. Your kingdom shall be confirmed for you from the time that you know that heaven rules." There's a disease called lycanthropy, or in this case, boanthropy. Lycanthropy comes from the Latin word for wolf, and it means somebody who has a mental disorder where they literally think that they're an animal. Or boanthropy is literally think that they're cattle, which seems to be the case with the king. It's been documented that people who have this disease, their fingernails will actually grow long like an animal's, and they may actually grow extra hair on their bodies. I don't know if Daniel fully understood what it was he was predicting, or if he was just speaking as God was telling him to speak. But imagine giving this kind of diagnosis to a king. How could Daniel speak such a difficult word? Well, he saw himself and the king as being under God's rules. In other words, he wasn't speaking to the most powerful man in the universe. He knew that God was the most powerful. And both he and the king were under God's authority. God ultimately decides who will rule the earth. And those who exercise authority ultimately represent God. From the time we were born until we're grown, every authority in our life shapes how we see God. But not every authority figure is godly or represents God well. We're told to pray for those in authority, that God would guide them and correct them where needed. But God is sovereign. And as sovereign, he is the ultimate authority. God is sovereign. Here's the next fill in the blank. However, you always have a choice. You always have a choice. That's the balance to sovereignty. Verse 27, "Therefore, O king, let my counsel be acceptable to you. Break off your sins by practicing righteousness, and your iniquities by showing mercy to the oppressed, that there may perhaps be lengthening of your prosperity." A prophetic word has several parts. There's the actual word, image, impression, dream. There's what you actually saw or heard. And then there's an interpretation or a meaning What does what you saw or heard mean? And then there's a third step. There's an application or instruction of what you are supposed to do with what was communicated. Oftentimes when we give prophetic words, I just encourage people, especially if they're not seasoned, to don't try to interpret what you heard. Just tell us what you heard. Just tell us what you saw. And now let's ask the Holy Spirit for an interpretation. And then the pastoral side of that is I have to take what God is speaking and say, okay, God, what do you want us to do with what you have said? We often think of a prophetic word as being final. And sometimes they are. But I think most of the time a prophetic warning is really an appeal to change what is otherwise a likely outcome. In other words, this is the path you are on. This is where you are headed. And God would only tell you that if there was some time or some way to be able to change that outcome. So the king's dream is showing him what would happen if he continues on the same course. That's why Daniel not only interprets the dream, but he also gives it an application. Repent. Repent while there's still time. Change. So maybe the king repented, and maybe he didn't. Whatever he did, it didn't change the outcome, it only delayed it. And that's the next fill in the blank. You can only fake it for a while. Let's pick up in verse 28. All this came upon King Nebuchadnezzar. At the end of 12 months, a year later, he was walking on the roof of the royal palace in Babylon. And the king answered and said, "Is this not the great Babylon which I have built by my mighty power as a royal residence for the glory of my majesty?" While the words were still in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven. "O King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken. The kingdom has departed from you, and you shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and you shall be made to eat grass like an ox, and 7 periods of time shall pass over you, until you know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he wills." You know, there's several commentators that suggest that the Hanging Gardens of Babylon was probably the rooftop that's mentioned here. If that's the case, then it wasn't just the town he was admiring. It was the technology that allowed him to enjoy vegetation on a scale previously unimagined. It was the architecture that enabled him to build higher than previously imagined. It was his man-made Eden without the presence of God. Think about it. You know where Babylon stood? Where Babel was built? Nebuchadnezzar thought he had succeeded where Babel had failed. But God was about to have the last word. And that brings us to our next section, acknowledging your source. What would it have been like for the king of a worldwide empire, the first worldwide empire, to suffer debilitating mental illness? What would it have been like for Daniel and the palace staff? You know, Ken Eberly pointed out to me in a recent conversation that God had Daniel there for more than just interpreting the king's dream. Daniel, you remember, was in charge of the palace. And he had the discipline to keep things in order for the king's eventual return. Some commentators suggest that his son may have been a co-regent during this time. Well, that's interesting because Azariah was the secretary to the crown prince, another one of God's people, in an influential place. Some people suggest that perhaps the king was merely locked away from the public in the palace garden. I think rather the text portrays a man driven out into the wilderness by his madness, only to be found again 7 years later when his mind had eventually returned to him. Let's pick up in verse 34. At the end of days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my reason returned to me. And I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever, for his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. See the book ends there? All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, and he does according to his will among the hosts of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand or say to him, "What have you done?" At the same time, my reason returned to me, and for the glory of my kingdom, my majesty and splendor returned to me. My counselors and my lords sought me, and I was established in my kingdom. And still more greatness was added to me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are right, and his ways are just. And those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. So let's do a little application of our own. What do we learn from this? First of all, reason comes from God. That's the first fill in the blank in this section. Reason comes from God. René Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am." In his search for meaning, he found that the search itself is proof of meaning. You know, the world assumes that intelligence is a sign of evolution. I think rather it points to an intelligent creator. Why should we think that the ability to think lofty thoughts and solve complex problems is to our own credit? If a computer is able to do the same thing, do we not give credit to the one who made it? Even artificial intelligence has the ability to learn because somebody programmed it with the ability to learn. But God created us for more than just mere intelligence. God created us in his image. He created us to love and to be loved. Try programming a computer for that. Philippians 2:5 in the Passion Translation says this, "And consider the example that Jesus, the Anointed One, has set before us. Let his mindset become your motivation." We lose our minds to gain the mind of Christ. It's in learning to love that we become what God created us to be. When we realize that we are made in his image and we look to that image as to what we are becoming. Here's the next thing we learn. Greatness comes from God. Greatness comes from God. As humans, we tend to measure greatness according to who is the most powerful, the most influential, or who is in control. Nebuchadnezzar had all of that. He had conquered the world militarily. Not only that, but he had mastered the arts, the sciences, and even a bit of mysticism. He created the most prestigious and elaborate city of his day, so much so that historians were still talking about it hundreds of years later. The Greeks, Josephus, they all mentioned these hanging gardens. But greatness is not achieved by being the best at something. If it were, then Nebuchadnezzar would be right. He would be right in his boasting because he was the best at just about everything. Here's what greatness is. Greatness was on display when God became an embryo in the womb of a young Jewish woman. Greatness was on display when he was born as a baby and learned to honor and to obey his parents as every other human child has to do. Greatness was on display when he washed his disciples' feet and he taught them to do the same. Greatness was on display when he wept and he identified with our suffering. Greatness was on display when he voluntarily went to the cross to purchase our forgiveness. Greatness was on display when he rose again to give us new life. Greatness, my friends, is not what you think it is. Jesus had to show us true greatness. And here's the last point. Humility comes from God. Humility comes from God. And then there are the people who already know all of this and already have mastered the art of being humble. Just ask them. They're humble. They'll tell you. Here's what I've learned. The more I try to follow Jesus' example, the more I realize that all of my efforts just show me how self-centered I am. Religion teaches us to be proud of our humility. But the Bible teaches us to delight in God, to delight in the God who made us. You know, I'm not sure if Nebuchadnezzar could have learned this lesson any other way. I certainly have difficulty repenting without God's help. Fortunately, in my lifetime, I have not completely lost my mind, although I have come close. But in those times of realizing my own weakness, I find out what God's strength can do in me and through me. Paul said the same thing. 2 Corinthians 12, 7-10 in the Passion Translation. The extraordinary level of revelations I've received is no reason for anyone to exalt me. For that is why a thorn in my flesh was given to me, the adversary's messenger sent to harass me, keeping me from becoming arrogant. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to relieve me of this, but he answered me, my grace is always more than enough for you, and my power finds its full expression through your weakness. So I'll celebrate my weakness. For when I'm weak, I sense more deeply the mighty power of Christ living in me. So I'm not defeated by my weakness, I'm delighted. For when I feel my weakness and endure mistreatment, when I'm surrounded with troubles on every side and face persecution because of my love for Christ, I am made yet stronger. For my weakness becomes a portal to God's power. Friends, it's Mother's Day. So let's celebrate those who gave us life. But it's also a good day to remember that God is our source, the source of every good thing. And when life lets you down, remember to look up. Here's some questions for reflection. Number one, was there a time in your life that you knew God in a way that was different than you do now? Remember that encounter you had with God. What did you learn from that experience? How has it changed you? Have you come to a place in your life where you are taking God for granted? Number two, does your inner life match your outer life? Are you really thriving, or are you just faking it? Are you moving higher toward becoming more like God? Or are you becoming more like an animal? Number three, who is the ultimate authority in your life? Does God's sovereignty comfort you, or does it concern you? What would it mean for you to acknowledge God as your source? And here's the ultimate question. Are you willing to become weak to become strong? Let's worship the Lord as we respond to this.